Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. Alright, so for this video, I'm going to be talking about all of my favorite horror books that I've read this year in the year 2021. I've actually read quite a bit of horror this year. Normally, I'm more of a fantasy reader slash Stephen King slash George R.R. Martin reader, but I kind of branched out and tried a whole bunch of different horror books, and a lot of these are brand new authors to me, and some of these books are just my favorite books of the year, and some of them have even climbed up to the ranks of favorite books of all time. So I'm very excited to talk about all of these horror novels. All right, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So these are my favorite horror books, but let's go ahead and start out with some books that maybe aren't 100% horror, but they definitely horrified me anyway. So we're going to start out with a book that I've talked a lot about on my channel, and that would be The Push by Ashley Audrain. Now this book, and I don't want to necessarily say too much about what actually goes on in here, because it's definitely one of those books like you should just jump into it not knowing a lot about it. It does have to do with a mother, and some things happen, and it's a rare book for me because it was very dread-inducing, and there's just a moment in here where it really got to me. Like, it was a gut punch to my soul, and I'm very excited for people to start reading this and see if they have a similar reaction to what I had, because I definitely felt it. And normally books I just kind of shrug off. I'm like, oh, that was pretty dark, but then I move on. But this book kind of just stuck with me. And there's even a particular line in this book where I'm just like, oh, why did you have to say that? Oh no. Yeah, but so it's not necessarily a horror book. I think it gets categorized more as a thriller, or maybe even just fiction, but I would call it a horror novel. It's pretty horrifying what happens in this book. So yeah, I think it's pretty fitting. So The Push, and then we have an author who's definitely a horror author, but this book in particular is more on the thriller side, kind of a good blend of the two, and that would be Getaway by Zoe Stage. She's quickly becoming one of my favorite horror writers. I love her two novels, Baby Teeth and Wonderland, and those are definitely more on the horror side than this one. This one is about a group of three women who all know each other, and they're good friends, and they're trying to get to know each other again, and so they go out on their trip to the Grand Canyon, and then things happen. Again, I want to be kind of vague with a lot of these books, but after I read Wonderland, and reread Wonderland, I was hoping that this book would kind of go in a similar vein of what Wonderland did, which Wonderland went in a very weird direction. But this book kind of went in a more straightforward direction, and at first I was slightly disappointed with that. But then I just kind of was just like, you know what, let's just go with it and see where it goes. And I actually ended up very much enjoying this. But even though Baby Teeth and Wonderland were 5 stars, this was more of a 4.5-star read. I still really liked it, and it's more of a thriller book. But like I said, it's a good blend of horror and thriller. So those are the two books that are kind of like part way horror, part thriller. But I wanted to include them anyway. And then we have a book that's the third book in one of my all-time favorite series, the Joel Goldberg series, which that would be You Love Me by Caroline Kepnes. Now, this horror series is interesting because it is definitely horror. There's horrifying things that happen, but it's really more of a black comedy and a satire, so it's not necessarily scary, even though, like, if you were in the book in the story, it would probably be very terrifying. But Joe Goldberg is just one of my favorite characters of all time. And this book in particular is probably my favorite of the series. Very funny, lots of dark humor, and I had a very good time reading this book. And not scary, but, very good nonetheless. So, very good horror novel, but also very funny. And then we have a couple horror novels that are just actually straight up horror. Like they're pretty gruesome. So we've got the first one, which would be The Butterfly Garden by Dut Hutchinson, whatever. And this one was very disturbing. It starts out with this girl in the hospital, and she's being interviewed by these detectives, and they're trying to figure out what happened to her. And she basically is telling the story of how she got abducted by this dude who takes her and a bunch of other young women to his butterfly garden. And what he does is he holds them captive. I can speak. He holds them captive, and he slowly tattoos butterfly wings on their backs. And then when he deems them ready, he kills them and preserves them in his butterfly garden. Very disturbing, and I really enjoyed this, not only because of how gruesome and dark it was, but the main character, her narration of like what's going on and how she kind of dealt with everything was very fascinating. And I highly recommend this book for anyone who really loves disturbing horror. Like, it's pretty disturbing, so it's very good, and I highly recommend it. Another great horror novel. This might be more of a novella, but either way, it was very good. It would be The Goners by L. Stevenson. This one is just kind of a straight up serial killer story. You've got this guy who is going around killing people, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And this one, I basically buddy read with Sharon Dwyer in like a night. I think we read it in like 3 to 4 hours, and it was just very good and very compulsive. Like I wanted to just keep it's very short. It's not like impressive or anything that we read it fast, but it was very good, very compulsive, and I just wanted to figure out like what was going on. And like the way that the killer like decided to kill people in this story was just, it felt very unique and just very gruesome, and just like, what the hell is going on here? I had a very good time with this book. Not perfect. I think I gave it around 4 stars, but I had a blast reading this. And I think the sequel is due to come out in 2022, I think. So I'm very anxious to get my hands on that when it comes out. But yeah, The Goners, very good. Another horror writer that I decided to try out because of my good friend Joanna, she really recommended me a book by Brahm. And when she told me about it, I was like, oh yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. And then I found out that a lot of his books are narrated by Kirby Hayborn, which, if you know about my Audible taste, I love Kirby Hayborn, my all-time favorite narrator. And so when I figured out that he narrated The Child Thief and Krampus, I got very excited. And the first one that I read was The Child Thief, and I very much enjoyed this. This is very much a very dark retelling of Peter Pan, and I was very interested in that. And not only was the plot good, the characters were great, Kirby Hayborn's narration was perfect as always. The physical copy, which I got my hands on, also has illustrations throughout the book, and that's very cool as well. So I had a very good time with this. Not completely perfect. I gave it 4.5 stars, but very, very good book. However, in this month, December, when I'm filming it, I'm sure this video won't come out till January, but oh well. Krampus, which is also narrated by Kirby Hayborn and has tons of great pictures throughout. Let's see if I can get a good one here. Here's the first one. Santa running away there. This book was a lot of fun. Probably not, like, the characters in The Child Thief were probably better than the characters in Krampus, but I think the actual story and, like, what goes on in Krampus was a lot more fun. And this was just a really fun book, especially during December and Christmas when I was reading it. It was a lot of fun. And I really didn't know a whole lot about Krampus, so I actually felt like I learned a little bit about Krampus, and then just, like I said, the story, and it's basically Krampus versus Santa Claus. Like, let's be real. It was really good. It was very fun, and it also had some very dark moments, which The Child Thief, you know, also had a lot of dark moments. This one at the start kind of was just like, it's Krampus versus Santa Claus, and this random dude from, like, West Virginia kind of gets swept up in it, and you're like, damn. But there's some hard-hitting moments, like, especially, there's one scene towards the end of the book where you're like, oh man, where you learn about someone's backstory. It's really rough. But yeah, this, if you want, like, a fun Christmas horror book, I couldn't recommend Krampus enough. I absolutely love this book. 5 stars. And now we're going to get to one of my favorite horror writers now. Might even be like my second favorite horror writer other than Stephen King. And his name happens to be Stephen as well. I'm, of course, talking about Stephen Graham Jones. And I, of course, have a lot of books here. I've been reading Stephen Graham Jones all year, or half the year, really. And just, I have loved almost everything the man has written other than, like, one book. Like, The Last Final Girl was okay, but everything else has just been stellar. And it all started with The Only Good Indians, which, again, is one of the most unique horror books I've ever read. And just, I really liked the characters. I really liked, like, the unique pacing and the unique storytelling that Stephen Graham Jones utilizes. And there's some scenes in here that, like, it's just like, where else am I going to get that in a book other than Stephen Graham Jones? Like, the final, like, showdown of, like, you know, and it's hard to talk about without spoiling it, but, like, the last few chapters, I'm just like, okay, this is awesome. So yeah, The Only Good Indians, fantastic. And also one other book that I don't have physically yet. I'm still waiting for the paperback. I don't particularly like hardcovers, so I'm waiting to get My Heart as a Chainsaw in paperback. I absolutely loved that book too. 5 stars. I really liked the main character in that one because I connected with her struggle of, like, really liking horror movies as a kid and no one else did. That was me in middle school. I loved horror movies and everyone's like, I like Disney movies. I'm like, no. And then a couple other Stephen Graham Jones horror books. The Least of My Scars, which, not a perfect book, but sorry, Evie. Sorry, calm down. Again, this is more like a 4-star book, but it was very good and very disturbing. It's basically Stephen Graham Jones writing about a serial killer, and it's very weird. It's very disturbing, and it's very much a fever dream. I'm sure a lot of people will describe it that way because it's true. It's like, for half of this book, or more than half of this book, I'm like, is what's going on, like, even real? Like, is any of this actually happening? And it was very good up until the very end, where you kind of realize what's going on. I think Evie had to, like, explain it to me, but very good nonetheless. And then quite possibly one of my favorites, if not my favorite, my most recent Stephen Graham Jones read, Night of the Mannequins, which is a novella, and I absolutely loved Night of the Mannequins. Very fun book. It's got some hard-hitting stuff in it, but also it was weirdly funny. Like, it was, I hope he meant it as kind of a dark comedy, because there were some scenes in here and some line deliveries where I'm just like, this is hilarious. But again, it's very dark, but I really liked it, and it was very funny. And again, I love when authors have the ability to write not only novels but also novellas and short stories. So I just have a very great feeling that Stephen Graham Jones is gonna, he might even be a top 10 author for me at this point. I've been collecting all of his books and just been loving most of his books, kind of like Stephen King a little bit. So yeah, that's Stephen Graham Jones, man. And then I kind of saved my two favorite horror books for last, and I will talk about this one. Let me grab it. And that would be Later by Stephen King, which I read pretty much at the beginning of the year. I think it was either February or March, very early on. And even though, like, Stephen King himself, well, actually not Stephen King, but the main character, the main narrator in the story does call this a horror story. It's debatable whether or not it's actually horror. I might call it a horror. Well, I'm including it in this list, aren't I? But yeah, I think it leans more towards horror. Definitely more than Billy Summers was. Billy Summers was more of a thriller. I think this tends to lead more towards horror. So I'm going to include it here. And to be honest, like, could I really make like a top whatever horror related books without including Stephen King? Probably not, especially with me being a Stephen King booktuber. But yeah, even if it wasn't a horror book, I absolutely love this book. 5 stars, one of the best, like, newer Stephen King books that I've read. Even though I do love new Stephen King, which a lot of people don't, which is a shame. This is definitely one of the better ones, and I gave it 5 stars. It's kind of a ripoff of The Sixth Sense, but even Stephen King's like, whatever. But because I mean, I could go on a huge rant about Stephen King taking unoriginal ideas or dumb ideas and making them into spectacular books, but I won't go into that. Salem's Lot and like Christine. But, whatever. But this, either way, is very good. And he does take the premise and puts his own spin on it. And it's very good. And recently, Andrew read this and he very much enjoyed it. And I'm glad he did. And yeah, just one of the best horror books I read this year. But not the best. The number 1 spot goes to... Could it be anything else, people? Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. Not only is it the best horror novel I've read all year, quite possibly the best horror novel I've ever read. It is a firm top 10 book for me of all time. And yeah, I am super glad that I decided to read it this year. I think I read it way back in like April after, watching several Jessie May videos where she just mentions this book over and over again because it's her favorite book of all time. Yeah, I've said a lot about this book already because I did a book review way back early on in my channel. Like I said, probably like April or May. So I've already talked about this book in length, so I won't go too much into detail, but it's very good. And even though it's 700 pages, I flew through it in like 3 days. And the characters are so good. And I love when authors decide to take risks with their stories. Because a lot of times you just get an author who kind of just writes the same thing over and over again because they know it's going to sell. But Stephen Chbosky, I know he originally wrote, was it The Perks of Being a Wallflower, like 20 years prior to this. And I guess it was more of like a young adult contemporary romance kind of deal. And then he comes out with this book. And it goes in directions where when you start reading it and you don't really know a lot about it, you can't really predict the direction it's going to go in. And once you get there, you just got to be along for the ride. And and just kind of let it wash over you, just like, what the hell is happening here? And yeah, it's also just got one of the best mother-son relationships I've ever read in any book, and it's so good, and I can't wait to reread this again sometime in the future. I'm very excited for that. And yeah, it's not my favorite, it's not my absolute favorite book I've read this year. I will say that. That goes to Daisy Jones and the Six. That was probably a top 5 favorite book, but Imaginary Friend, top 10 book for me this year, and easily the best horror book I've read in 2021. So that about wraps that up. So those are all of my favorite horror novels that I've read in 2021. Please let me know what you guys thought of this video down in the comments below. And please let me know if you've read any of these books that I mentioned here, whether you liked them, whether you hated them, whether you thought they were kind of meh. But, or on the flip side, if you're interested in picking any of these books up, please let me know down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.